The morning Alma Rhodes shook hands with a stranger over a dead man's land. She told herself it was the smartest thing she had ever done, and she almost believed it. The sun had barely cracked the rim of the eastern hills when she rode into Dusty Creek, her jaw set and her dark hair pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better decades. The town of Dusty Creek, Texas, in the year 1878, was not a beautiful place. It was the kind of settlement that existed because the railroad had passed close enough to make it worth somebody's while. A collection of clapboard storefronts and sun-bleached signs strung along a single main road that turned to mud when it rained and to fine red powder when it did not. The livery stable smelled of horse and old hay. The general store had a crooked porch. The saloon, which doubled as the only hotel, had a piano that was perpetually half a note flat on the high end. Alma had ridden 40 miles to get here, and her horse, a gray mare named Biscuit, was tired and showing it in the way she dragged her left foreleg just slightly with each step. Alma noted this and felt a twist of guilt. She had pushed the animal harder than she should have because she was terrified that if she did not arrive before anyone else, the opportunity would be gone. The opportunity was a ranch, not just any ranch. It was the old Hargrove property, 312 acres of good grazing land and a freshwater creek that ran year-round, with a solid timber house, 2 working barns, and a cattle herd that the bank had assessed at a respectable number. Owen Hargrove had died without a will and without children, leaving behind a complicated tangle of debt and possibility. The bank in Dusty Creek held the note on the property, and they wanted it settled fast. They had placed a notice in 3 county newspapers, and Alma had read it by lamplight in her boarding house room in Caldwell 3 nights ago and had not slept since. She had money. Not enough money, but some. Her father had left her $200 in a tin behind the loose hearthstone of the house she had grown up in, and she had found it only after his funeral. It was the most money she had ever held, and she knew it would not be enough to buy a ranch outright, not even a troubled one. But she had a plan. The plan was thin and risky, and dependent entirely on whether a particular man she had never met was as reasonable as the letter she had received about him suggested. His name was Abraham Granger. She had learned of him through a mutual acquaintance, a cattle broker named Percival Dodd, who had written to her after her father's death, expressing condolences and mentioning, almost as an aside, that he knew a man who might be looking for a working arrangement regarding the Hargrove land. Abraham Granger was a cattle hand of some reputation, a man who had worked drives up from San Antonio for 6 years and had saved carefully. He had enough to cover the debt on the land but not the operational costs to make it profitable. Alma, on the other hand, had enough operational knowledge. She had grown up on a ranch and run it for 2 years after her father's health failed, but not enough capital. Together, on paper, they were exactly what the Hargrove property needed. That was the theory. The practice of it required her to actually meet Abraham Granger, agree on terms, and present themselves jointly to the bank before anyone else could get there first. Percival Dodd had written that Granger would be in Dusty Creek on the morning of April the 14th. It was currently the morning of April the 14th, and the sun was just barely touching the tops of the buildings as Alma guided Biscuit to the hitching post outside the saloon and dismounted. She patted the mare's neck. "I know," she said quietly. "We will get you water in a moment." She squared her shoulders, checked that her blouse was tucked straight, and pushed through the saloon door. The room inside smelled of wood smoke and last night's whiskey. The barkeep was wiping glasses behind the counter. 2 men sat at separate tables with coffee. At the far end of the room, near the window that faced east, a man sat alone with a cup in his hand and the early light full on his face. He was younger than she had expected. She had imagined someone weathered beyond recognition, the way long-time cattle hands often were, all leather skin and squinting eyes. But Abraham Granger, and she was certain it was him because he looked up at her entrance with the particular wariness of someone who was also waiting for a stranger, was perhaps 30 years old. His hair was dark brown, thick, and slightly unruly beneath the hat he had set on the table beside his coffee. His face was angular and honest, with a jaw that carried 2 days of shadow and eyes the color of creek water when the light hit it at a certain angle, something between gray and green that she could not quite name from across the room. He was lean but not thin, built in the way of men who worked hard and ate enough but not extravagantly. He wore a plain blue shirt, a leather vest with a worn left shoulder from what she guessed was a rifle rest, and boots that were clean despite the road. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, then stood up. That surprised her. She had not expected that particular courtesy. "Miss Rhodes," he said, and his voice was a low, careful thing, not unfriendly. "Mr. Granger," she replied, crossing the room and stopping at the opposite side of his table. She did not extend her hand first. She waited. He extended his. She shook it firmly, the way her father had taught her, and he matched her grip without trying to overpower it, which she noted as a good sign. "Sit down," he said, then seemed to catch himself. "Please, if you want to." She sat. The barkeep appeared at her elbow almost immediately with a second cup of coffee, and she accepted it with a nod of thanks. For a moment neither of them spoke. The morning light spread wider across the floor of the saloon, and outside the window the main street of Dusty Creek was beginning to stir with the early movement of the day. "The bank opens at 8, Alma said. "That gives us perhaps an hour to reach an agreement." "I know," Abraham said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I have been thinking about this since Percival Dodd wrote to me." "As have I," she said. "So let us be direct with each other. I think we will waste less time that way." Something shifted in his expression, not displeasure, more like a reassessment. "All right," he said. "Direct it is." Alma reached into the inner pocket of her coat and produced a folded paper. She had written down the terms she wanted to propose, because she had found that men tended to take her more seriously when they could see that she had prepared. She unfolded it and slid it across the table. He read it without picking it up, leaning forward slightly, his eyes moving down the page in steady lines. She watched him and tried to read his face. It was not an easy face to read. He had the quality of someone who had learned to keep his reactions internal, which either meant he was very controlled or very private. She was not certain yet which one. "You want an equal split of ownership," he said. "Yes. You bring the operational knowledge and $200 toward the first season's expenses. Correct. And I cover the bank debt and the initial cattle costs." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is not a usual arrangement." "No," she agreed. "It is not. Most men would not consider it." He looked up from the paper and directly at her, and there was something direct and steady in it that she found unexpectedly disarming. "I am not most men," he said, without any particular pride in it. "Just stating a fact." "That remains to be seen," she said. He picked up the paper then, reread the lower half of it and set it down again. "The part where you've written that decisions about the operation must be agreed upon jointly. That means neither of us can make major changes without the other's consent." "That is correct. And if we disagree, then we find a compromise or we seek a neutral third party, which I propose we designate as Percival Dodd, given that he knows us both." Abraham Granger turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, thinking. She watched the way his fingers moved, absently deliberate, the way a man moved when his mind was working somewhere else. His hands were the hands of someone who had done real work. There were calluses and a scar on his left thumb, and the particular roughness that came from roping and riding in all weather. But his expression when he was reading had been thoughtful and careful, not the face of a man who dealt only in muscle and reaction. "The agreement would end how?" he asked. "If it doesn't work out, either party may buy the other's share out at fair market value after a period of no less than 2 years, she said. "That gives the operation time to establish itself before either of us could be forced out cheaply. You've thought about this carefully." "I've thought about little else for 3 days, she admitted. That made him smile just slightly at the corner of his mouth. It changed his face considerably, made him look younger and also more real somehow. "Percival said you ran your father's ranch," he said. "For 2 years while his lungs failed him. Before that I grew up on it. I know cattle breeding, feeding cycles, grazing rotation, market timing. I can work alongside any hand on the property, and I do not intend to be a figurehead." "I wouldn't want a figurehead," he said. "I need a partner who can actually run things. Then we understand each other." He picked up the paper again, pulled a stub of pencil from his vest pocket, and made 3 small notations in the margin. Then he pushed it back across the table to her. She read his changes. The first was a clarification of the buyout timeline. The second was the addition of a clause requiring an annual accounting they would both review together. The third was simpler. He had added the word working before the word partner, as if to be certain it was on paper that this was a working arrangement and not a social one. She found that addition almost amusing, as if she needed reminding. "These are acceptable," she said. He extended his hand again. She shook it. "Sunrise," he said quietly, almost to himself, glancing out the window at the steadily brightening sky, "and we've gone into business together." "A practical arrangement," she agreed. "Practical," he repeated, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely, but his expression had settled back into that careful neutral that she could not quite read. They presented themselves at the bank at 5 minutes past 8 and were shown into the office of a Mr. Tillman, who was a compact, pink-faced man with spectacles that sat slightly crooked on his nose. He reviewed their combined financial position with the methodical skepticism of a man whose job had made him slow to be impressed. "A co-ownership arrangement," he said, looking from Alma to Abraham and back, "between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman." "A business arrangement," Alma said calmly, "the same as any 2 partners. The law does not require us to be related or married to jointly hold property in the state of Texas, Mr. Tillman." Mr. Tillman looked at Abraham, apparently waiting for him to have a different opinion. Abraham looked back at him steadily and said, "Miss Rhodes is correct." "Are there any other requirements we need to meet?" Mr. Tillman cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and proceeded with the transaction. The deed to the Hargrove property, which they decided together on the walk over, to rename Sunrise Ranch, partly because of the hour and partly because it felt like something that ought to have a name that was its own, was transferred to both their names by 10 o'clock that morning. They walked out of the bank into full morning sun and stood on the boardwalk with the folded deed in the leather satchel that Alma carried, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I suppose we should go see it," Abraham said. "I suppose we should," she agreed. It took them the better part of the morning to ride out to Sunrise Ranch, following the directions the bank clerk had drawn on a scrap of paper. The land opened up as they left the main road, the flat scrub giving way to gently rolling grassland that was already showing the first pale green of spring growth. The creek they had read about on the deed, a tributary of the upper Guadalupe, ran through the property at a diagonal, and they heard it before they saw it, a sound that Alma found immediately reassuring because running water meant life and growth and the possibility of sustaining a herd. The house was plain but well built, a single story of dark timber with a covered porch and 2 good chimneys. The windows were intact. The door had swollen in the frame from a season of disuse and required Abraham to put his shoulder to it before it gave, and the air inside was thick with dust and the particular staleness of a closed space, but the bones of it were solid. There were 4 rooms, a main living and cooking room, 2 bedrooms, and a small room at the back that had been used as an office. There was a cast iron stove, a table, 3 chairs, and a rope-strung bed frame in each bedroom. They stood in the main room and looked around in the dusty light coming through the windows. "It needs work," Abraham said. "Every good thing does," Alma replied. He looked at her sideways at that, and she looked back, and there was a brief, strange moment of something that she could not categorize and therefore chose not to examine. "We'll need to hire hands," she said, moving toward the back room to look at the papers that had been left in the desk. "The cattle will need checking. The winter may have done some damage to the herd numbers. I'll ride out and count them this afternoon," he said. "If you want to take stock of what's in the house and what we need to bring out from town." It was practical. It made sense. They were business partners, dividing tasks efficiently on the first day of their arrangement. Alma reminded herself of this firmly as she watched him cross back toward the door, pulling his hat from where he had hung it on a chair post, settling it on his head with the ease of a man who had worn a hat outdoors every day of his adult life. He paused in the doorway with the light behind him and said, "I'll be back before dark." "I'll have a fire going," she said, which was a practical statement about the stove and not anything else. "Good," he said and left. Alma stood in the empty room for a moment after his footsteps faded. Then she breathed in and set her hands on her hips and looked at the work in front of her. There was a great deal of it. The next 2 weeks were the hardest kind of work, the kind that has no particular drama or danger to it, only the grinding accumulation of physical labor and small decisions that slowly transform a neglected thing into a living one. They opened the windows and beat the rugs and scrubbed the stove and repaired the loose boards on the porch. They rode together to assess the herd and found it in reasonable condition, down from the previous owner's records but not disastrously so. They hired 2 ranch hands from Dusty Creek, a young man named Court who was 19 and strong as an ox and remarkably cheerful about hard work, and an older hand named Willie Sims who had worked cattle in Texas for 30 years and could diagnose a sick animal faster than a doctor could diagnose a sick person. Court and Willie lived in the bunkhouse at the back of the south barn, which was perfectly suited for exactly 2 men, and this arrangement meant that Alma and Abraham lived in the main house. They had each taken one of the bedrooms without any formal discussion about it, simply each gravitating to the one they first set their belongings in. It was practical, and there was nothing improper about it, and both of them were adults who understood that. Alma told herself this regularly. The thing was, and she was honest with herself about this even when she was not inclined to examine it closely, Abraham Granger was not what she had prepared herself for. She had prepared herself for someone difficult, someone she would need to manage or work around or assert herself firmly against at regular intervals. She had prepared herself for condescension, for the particular patronizing friendliness that some men deployed when they wanted to appear supportive while actually disagreeing with everything a woman said. Abraham was not like that. He was disagreeable in direct, honest ways when he disagreed, and agreeable in direct, honest ways when he agreed. And the two of them had arguments that were actual arguments, sharp and substantive and occasionally heated, followed by actual resolutions in which one or both of them changed position based on the other's argument, rather than simply because the other had raised their voice. It was, frankly, unlike anything she had experienced with a man before, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that. 3 weeks after they moved onto Sunrise Ranch, they had their first real argument. It was about the cattle, specifically, about whether to sell a portion of the herd before summer to secure cash reserves, or to hold them through the summer grazing season for a better autumn price. Abraham wanted to sell now, arguing that cash in hand was more valuable than potential cash in autumn, particularly in the first year when they could not afford uncertainty. Alma wanted to hold, arguing that the spring grass was exceptional this year, and the animals would put on significant weight through summer, easily justifying the weight. They argued about it for 3 days. Not continuously. There was too much other work for that, but in regular bursts, when one of them would bring it up again, or when the other would find a new piece of evidence to present. Willie Sims, for his part, kept carefully out of it. Court, who was too young and too cheerful to have good political instincts, made the mistake of offering an opinion on the second day, and then spent the third day finding reasons to be in the far pasture. On the evening of the third day, Alma was at the table with the ledger and Abraham came in from outside and hung his hat on its peg and washed his hands in the basin, and then came to stand at the end of the table and look at what she was doing. She had been mapping out the projected weight gains against the expected market prices, and it was, she had to admit, a closer question than she had initially presented it. The summer prices have been higher in 4 of the last 6 years, she said without looking up. But in the 2 years they weren't, ranches that held their herds went under, he said. Not because the strategy was wrong, because they couldn't survive a bad year. She looked up at that. Are you saying we can't survive a bad year? I'm saying we shouldn't have to find out in year 1, he said. He was not angry about it. He sounded tired and honest. We've got more riding on this than just the cattle decision, Alma. If we get this wrong in the first year, we don't have enough cushion. She sat back and looked at the ledger and then looked at him. He was standing with his arms crossed, not defensively, but the way a man stood when he was standing his ground because he genuinely believed in the ground. And she thought about what Percival Dodd had written in his letter about Abraham Granger, that he was the most careful man with money he had ever met who was still willing to take a risk. Sell half, she said. We sell half now, we hold the better half through summer. We take your cash security and my projected gains both. He was quiet for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms and nodded. Half, he agreed. They looked at each other across the table, and there was something in that moment, the particular warm quality of two people who have just found a piece of ground they can stand on together, that lingered after they both looked away. Alma went back to the ledger. Abraham put water on the stove for coffee. Outside the window, the Texas stars were coming out one by one in the big dark sky. How did you end up in cattle? She asked, not looking up from the ledger but curious. He poured the water into the pot and was quiet for a moment. My father had a small farm in Tennessee, he said. Good land but not enough of it. When I was 17, a man came through looking for hands for a drive north and I signed on. I was young enough to think it was adventure. Was it? Parts of it. He brought 2 cups to the table and set one by her elbow without her asking. The first drive I made, we were on the trail 90 days. I found out I was good at it, not the adventure parts, the real parts. Moving animals efficiently, reading weather, keeping a herd calm. He sat down across from her. And I liked the land out here. Tennessee is beautiful, but it's small and tight. Out here everything is open. Alma understood that. She had grown up in this landscape, and even after years she found something in the scale of the Texas sky that was necessary to her, like air. Your father's farm, she said. You didn't go back. He died while I was on my second drive. By then there wasn't much to go back to. He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, but she heard the texture under the matter-of-fact tone, the careful way a person spoke about a loss they had packed away. My father died last year, she said. His lungs. She paused. It was slow. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. She could hear that he meant it. He taught me everything I know about running cattle, she said. He wanted a son and got me, and he didn't particularly adjust his expectations. He just taught me instead. She said this with a dry warmth that was not quite humor and not quite grief. I think he was surprised when he realized I was better at it than he was. Abraham's mouth curved. He sounds like someone I would have liked. He would have argued with you constantly, she said. He had opinions about everything. I don't mind arguing, Abraham said. I've noticed, she said. He laughed then. A real laugh, unexpected and warm, and she found herself smiling into the ledger before she had made a decision to do so. A month into the arrangement, Dusty Creek sent them trouble in the form of a man named Rutherford Clay. Rutherford Clay was a land speculator who had made a comfortable living in the years following the war by identifying properties with problems and inserting himself into those problems before they could be resolved cleanly. He was a tall man, pale-haired and well-dressed in the way of someone who wanted to be taken for a gentleman, without being willing to actually behave like one. He arrived at Sunrise Ranch on a Tuesday morning on a very fine horse, and tied it to their porch rail with the confidence of a man who expected to be welcomed. Alma saw him from the barn and walked over with the particular alertness of someone who recognized the type. Miss Rhodes, he said, tipping his hat with a smile that had been practiced in a mirror. Rutherford Clay, I believe we have mutual acquaintances. We might, she said. What can I do for you, Mr. Clay? He looked around at the property with an appreciative expression that was somehow insulting. "I heard about the Hargrove purchase. I must say I was sorry to have been a day late to that transaction. Beautiful property." "It is," she agreed. "Also a settled transaction. Can I help you with something specific?" He turned the practiced smile back to her. "I represent some interests in San Antonio who are looking to expand their land holdings in this county. I've been authorized to make a significant offer for the property." Alma kept her expression level. "The property is not for sale." "Perhaps Mr. Granger might see it differently," Clay said, and the particular emphasis he placed on Granger's name was both a challenge and a suggestion that she was not the one who actually mattered here. "Mr. Granger and I are equal partners," Alma said, "and we do not make decisions separately. But I can tell you that Mr. Granger will tell you the same thing I am telling you." Clay studied her for a moment with the look of a man recalibrating. "Why don't we set a figure on the table," he said, "and let—" "No," she said pleasantly. "Thank you for making the ride out. The road back to town is the same one you came in on." He left, but she did not like the look on his face when he left. It was the look of a man who was used to finding another angle when the first one was declined. She told Abraham about it over supper. He listened without interrupting, which was something she had come to appreciate about him. He let her finish before he spoke. "Rutherford Clay," he said, after she had finished. "I know that name. He was sniffing around a property in Gonzales County last year. The family ended up selling under what I'd call pressure." "What kind of pressure?" "Legal challenges to the deed, harassment of their hands, supplier problems." He looked at the supper plate in front of him and then looked up at her. "He's patient and he's thorough." "So are we," Alma said. "Yes," Abraham said, "we are." Something passed between them in that moment, a quiet alignment that was more than strategy. They looked at each other across the table, and Alma felt the thing she had been carefully not examining press itself a little more firmly against her attention. She looked away. She picked up her fork. "I'll write to Percival Dodd tomorrow and ask him to make discreet inquiries about Clay's backing. If we know who he's actually working for, we'll know what kind of fight we're in." "Good thinking," Abraham said. He was quiet for a moment. "You're good at this." She glanced at him. He was not looking at her. He was cutting something on his plate, his attention apparently on his food, but she had the sense that the words had come out slightly more personal than he had intended, and that he was giving them both space around them. "So are you," she said. It was the first week of June when the creek rose. A series of late storms had come up from the south, the warm, wet kind that the Gulf sent inland in early summer, and the creek that cut through their property had been climbing steadily for 4 days. On the 5th day, it broke its banks and flooded the south lower pasture, which was where they had moved the younger cattle for the summer grass. They worked through a full night, she and Abraham and Court and Willie, moving animals in the dark and rain to higher ground, slipping in the mud, calling to each other through the sound of the water that was everywhere. Alma lost her hat somewhere in the dark and did not have time to care about it. She worked a rope alongside Court, herding the most reluctant steers up the slope, while Abraham and Willie worked the far edge of the pasture. At some point in the early hours before dawn, when the rain had eased but not stopped, and the cattle were safe on the ridge, and they were all soaked through and exhausted, Abraham appeared beside her in the darkness and handed her a rope that she needed without her having to ask for it. And she took it, and their hands overlapped briefly in the passing, and neither of them remarked on it, but she was aware of it for longer than she should have been. By the time the sky began to lighten, they had all 4 of them moved 24 cattle in the dark, and the herd was safe, and the creek was still rising, but it had found its new temporary bank and would not, they thought, climb further. They stood on the high ground above the pasture and watched the brown water catch the first gray light of morning. Willie said something about going to make coffee and took Court with him, which left Alma and Abraham standing on the ridge in the wet grass in the early light. She was soaked and muddy, and she knew her hair was loose and tangled from the work, and she was so tired that the tiredness had gone through the first unpleasant stage and come out the other side into something that felt almost like peace. She could feel Abraham standing beside her, the particular warmth of another person on a cold, wet morning. "Good herd," he said quietly, meaning that they had saved them, that the work had counted. "Good team," she said. He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and they were standing closer than she had realized, close enough that she could see the water running down the line of his jaw and the particular expression in his eyes, which was not the careful neutral she had come to know as his default, but something more open, more immediate. She felt her heart do something unhelpful. "Alma," he said, and then stopped. "Don't," she said quickly, lightly, because she was not ready. "You'll ruin a perfectly good business arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "Is that what I was going to do?" She looked back at the creek. "Go get some dry clothes and some sleep, Abraham." He did. But he was smiling slightly when he turned away, and she saw it, and she stood on the ridge a moment longer looking at the flooded pasture and admitting to herself, with the particular honest reluctance of a very practical person, that the business arrangement had been in some trouble since approximately the second day. June became July, and July had the kind of heat that settled into the bones of the land and the house and the people working it. Alma's days had a rhythm now that she had come to find satisfying in a deep and physical way up before sunrise, out with the herd in the long cool of the morning, the work of the middle day, the accounts and planning in the evenings when the heat released its grip slightly. She was good at this life. She had always known she was good at it, but knowing it alone in a boarding house in Caldwell was different from living it in the full measure of a working operation that was actually working. And Abraham he was everywhere in it. That was the truest way to say it. He was not intrusive. He did not hover or second-guess or insert himself into her work for the sake of presence. But the ranch was a shared organism, and he was half of it, and she encountered him constantly in the natural course of the day, passing on the porch in the morning, conferring about the herd over noon, at the same table in the evenings with the account books between them. There was a domestic ease to it that she had not anticipated, and that she thought, sometimes, he had not anticipated either. Willie Sims was not subtle about his opinions. He was a 60-year-old man from West Texas who had long since lost patience with circumspection, and he tended to express himself directly and without invitation. "That man watches you when you're not looking," he said to Alma one afternoon when they were at the south pasture fence, and she was checking a section of wire and Abraham was riding the far edge of the property with Court. "He watches everything," Alma said. "He's a careful man." "He doesn't watch the fence line the way he watches you," Willie said. Alma kept her hands on the wire. "We are business partners, Willie." "Yes, ma'am," Willie said, in a tone that meant he found this description highly incomplete. She was aware of herself being more careful after that, more deliberate, about not letting herself linger in moments that might grow into something. She was aware of pulling back from the natural drift that two people who worked together and respected each other tended toward. She was aware, most acutely, that her pulling back was noticeable to Abraham even when she did not intend it to be. He came to her one evening in early July when the sun had gone down, but the sky was still bright in the west, a specific shade of orange fading to rose that Alma privately thought was one of the finest things Texas had to offer. She was on the porch with the ledger, but she was not really looking at it. She was looking at the sky. Abraham came out with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her and sat in the second chair and also looked at the sky for a while without speaking. "I think," he said eventually, "that we should talk about what we're not talking about." Alma turned the coffee cup in her hands. "We're talking about very many things most days." "Alma." She looked at him. He was looking at her, that open expression that she had seen only a few times and that consistently did something to her chest. "I know this isn't what we agreed to," he said. "I know the arrangement was clear. But I think you've known for a while that he stopped, and the careful man that he was searched for words that were precise enough to be honest without being reckless, that I find it increasingly difficult to think of this as only a business arrangement." She was quiet for a moment. The sky deepened in the west. A night bird called from the direction of the creek. "Abraham," she said, "we have to live and work together on this land. She stopped. If we complicate this and then it doesn't work, we lose everything. The ranch, the arrangement, all of it." "I know," he said. "I've thought about that too." "Have you?" "Extensively." He looked at his coffee. "But I also think, and tell me if I'm wrong, that not saying anything doesn't actually make it go away. It just makes it something that sits between us and pretends not to be there." She found she could not argue with that because she could not find a flaw in the logic and because the logic matched exactly what she had been experiencing. "I don't know what you want me to say," she said, which was not quite honest. "I think you do," he said, gently. The sky went another shade deeper. She looked at him, actually looked at him, the way she had been careful not to let herself do too openly, and found that he was looking back at her with the same quality she had felt herself having, the kind of looking that was trying to be sure. "I am terrified," she said, which was the truest thing she could offer. "So am I," he said. "You don't seem terrified." "I'm very good at seeming calm," he said, and the brief humor in it was not light. It was the kind of humor that a person reached for when they were telling the truth about something difficult. She breathed out. The sky was nearly dark now, the first stars appearing in the east while the west still held its orange. She thought about her father who had loved this land and taught her to love it. She thought about the boarding house room in Caldwell where she had read the notice by lamplight and felt, for the first time since her father died, the particular kind of hope that lives specifically in possibility. She thought about a gray morning on a flooded ridge and the way his hand had felt in the dark. "Abraham," she said quietly. "Yes." "Don't make promises yet," she said. "Let's let this be what it is for now, and see." He was still for a moment, then he nodded just once. "All right," he said, "we can do that." They sat on the porch until the stars were fully out and the night had settled over the ranch, and there was no dramatic gesture and no declaration. But when she finally went inside, she was aware of something having shifted, some last layer of her careful management of the situation having been set down. It was, she thought, both more frightening and considerably more comfortable than what had come before it. Rutherford Clay returned in August with something more concrete and more threatening than a purchase offer. He arrived in Dusty Creek with legal papers from a San Antonio attorney claiming a defect in the original Hargrove deed, suggesting that a prior lien on the property had not been properly discharged, and that the bank sale had therefore been invalid. It was the kind of claim that was very hard to disprove quickly and very easy to use as leverage, because even if it was ultimately wrong, the process of fighting it could take months and would cost money they did not have in abundance. Abraham heard about it first, from the bank clerk who sent a boy out to the ranch with a note on a Thursday morning. He read the note twice, then found Alma in the east pasture and showed it to her. She read it and her expression went flat in the way it did when she was genuinely angry and controlling it. "He's manufactured this," she said. "Almost certainly," Abraham agreed. "But manufactured or not, we have to answer it." They rode into Dusty Creek together that afternoon and spent 2 hours with Mr. Tillman at the bank, who was deeply unhappy about the whole situation and somewhat inclined to wring his hands rather than act. Abraham, who was generally quiet in the presence of institutional authority, was not quiet that afternoon. He was composed but immovable, and he asked precise questions about the original deed processing, the prior lien in question, and the procedure for challenging the claim, and he took notes on a page in a small notebook that he carried in his vest pocket. Alma handled Tillman's hand-wringing. She sat across from him and spoke to him in calm, certain terms about the legal facts as she understood them, and she had done enough reading on property law in Texas, because she had spent 2 days in the Caldwell Library before this adventure began, to speak to it with enough authority that Tillman stopped wringing his hands and started listening. By the end of the afternoon, they had secured the bank's agreement to actively contest the claim on the grounds that the prior lien had in fact been discharged. They had a written record of the date and circumstances of the claim's filing, and they had identified the San Antonio attorney whose name was on the papers as a man who had appeared in 3 prior similar cases involving Rutherford Clay. 3 times, Abraham said when they walked out of the bank. Same attorney, same kind of claim. We need to write to those other properties, Alma said. Find out what happened. Find out if any of them challenged it or if they all just sold. I'll write tonight, he said. And I'll write to Percival Dodd. He has connections in San Antonio. He might be able to identify who Clay is actually working for. They stood on the boardwalk in the late afternoon sun, and Abraham turned to look at the general store window and then back at her, and she saw the set of his shoulders and the quality of his expression and recognized it as the way he looked when he was thinking beyond the immediate problem. Clay is going to push harder, he said. This is just the first move. I know, she said. Is this more than you bargained for? She looked at him directly. Are you asking me if I want to fold? No, he said. I know you don't want to fold. I'm asking if you're all right. The distinction and the care in it caught her slightly off guard. She breathed in the dry August air. I'm all right, she said. I'm angry and I'm going to use it. Something in his expression settled. Good, he said. So am I. They ate a late supper in a small place off the main street. They had not planned to stay in town, but it was late to make the ride back, and something about the evening had a different quality than their usual meals at the ranch. They were at a small table in a room with other people, in public, and the particular privacy that the ranch provided was absent, and she was aware of herself and Abraham in relation to the room in a way she was not usually aware when they were at home. Home. She had used that word in her head and noticed it. They talked through the strategy for handling Clay's claim, and they talked about the autumn cattle plans. And at some point, the conversation turned, as it increasingly did in the evenings, away from business and toward the less structured kind of talking that was about the texture of their lives. He told her about the cattle drives, the ones before Texas, when he had been on the Kisham Trail and driven herds north into Kansas, the particular loneliness of those months on the trail, and also the particular feeling of scale that came from moving through that landscape. You see places out there, he said, that no one has built anything on yet. The grass goes so far it looks like it's breathing. He looked at her across the table. It's the same feeling as your ranch land, as our land. She had noted the hour and felt it land. I used to ride out to the ridge above our creek in the evenings, she said, after my father had gone to bed, just to be alone with it, the way the light went. She paused. I used to think I might be the only person in the world who loved it exactly that way. And now, he asked. She looked at him. Now I'm less sure of that, she said. He was quiet. Then carefully, I ride out there some evenings after supper when the light is going. I know, she said. I've seen you. I know you've seen me, he said. The table was small. The candle between them was burning low. The room had grown quieter around them as the hour grew later, and Alma was acutely aware of him. The way he sat, attentive and still, the way the light moved on his face, the way his hands rested on the table, close enough that the distance between them felt like a decision rather than a circumstance. I think, she said very quietly, that sunrise was a very long time ago. He looked at her with those creekwater eyes and said, just as quietly, and yet here we are at nearly moonrise, and I cannot for the life of me remember why this was only meant to be business. She felt her breath catch, not in a dramatic way. In the way that something true, when it is said out loud by the right person, makes your body acknowledge it before your mind finishes. Neither can I, she admitted. They looked at each other in the candlelight of a small restaurant in Dusty Creek, Texas, in August of 1878, and the business arrangement that had been made at sunrise was gone, quietly and completely, replaced by something that had been growing steadily in its place for 4 months, and that was, she thought, considerably better. He reached across the table very slowly and turned his hand palm up. An invitation, not a demand. She looked at his hand. Then she placed hers in it. I should tell you, he said, his thumb moving once across her knuckles, That I haven't done this particularly carefully where you're concerned. I've tried. I thought it was the right thing to keep it professional." "So did I," she said. "I think I was wrong," he said. "I think we were both very sensible and also very wrong," she said. He laughed and she laughed, and something that had been held tightly for a long time released in both of them at once. And the room, the candle, the evening outside the window, all of it felt, to Alma, like the particular warm quality of something beginning rather than something already underway. The fight with Rutherford Clay lasted through August and into September. It was not violent. There was never any direct physical confrontation, because Clay was too careful for that, but it was sustained, and at times draining. He sent a second attorney's letter claiming additional procedural problems. He apparently spoke to one of their suppliers in town, because there was a week in mid-August when their order of wire fencing was delayed without explanation. He was also, they discovered through Percival Dodd's inquiries, working on behalf of a land consolidation company out of San Antonio that was quietly buying up mid-sized ranch properties in 3 counties. The responses they had received from the other properties Clay had targeted were useful. 2 of the 3 had caved and sold. The third had fought and won, using a combination of documentary evidence and testimony from a county records clerk who had personally verified the deed history. Alma wrote to that property, a family named Vasquez in Comal County, and received a detailed letter back from the eldest daughter, Elena Vasquez, who had handled the legal fight herself. The Vasquez letter was 40 pages long and contained more useful practical information than anything else they had received in the entire dispute. Alma read it twice and gave it to Abraham, who read it twice and then looked up and said, "She's thorough." "She is," Alma said. "She's been fighting this kind of thing in her county for 3 years. Her family has been in Texas since before annexation, and she says Clay's operation specifically targets properties owned by women or minorities because they calculate those owners will have less institutional support." Abraham's expression went very still for a moment. "He targeted us," he said, "because of you." "Because of me, partly," Alma agreed. "He may have thought I was easier to push out than a man alone would be. He may also have simply looked at the co-ownership and seen complexity he could exploit." "He was wrong," Abraham said. "He was," she said, "on both counts." They filed their legal response in mid-August, citing the county records evidence, the prior discharge of the lien, and the pattern of similar claims made by the same attorney on behalf of Clay. The county judge, a dry and deliberate man named Henderson, heard the matter in the first week of September and dismissed Clay's claim in full, noting in his written ruling that the deed was sound. The prior lien had been properly discharged, and the challenge appeared to be without basis in fact. The morning that ruling came in, Abraham read it standing in the barn with the paper in his hand and the September light coming through the open door, and then he looked up at Alma, who had just come in from the morning check on the herd, and he held up the paper and said, "It's done." She crossed the barn in about 6 strides and took the paper from him and read it herself, the particular habit of someone who always needed to read things with her own eyes. And when she finished, she looked up at him, and for a moment she just let herself feel it, the relief, the vindication, the satisfaction of having held their ground. He was watching her with that open expression. She handed the paper back to him and said, "Good." "That's all," he said. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know, something more than good." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, which was something she had not done before and which she did because she wanted to and because it felt right and because she had been holding herself carefully for long enough. He went still for about 1 second. She felt it, the brief moment of surprise, and then his arms came around her, and he held her the way someone held another person when they had wanted to do it for a long time. "Very good," she said into his shoulder. He laughed quietly, and his arms tightened slightly, and they stood in the barn with the September light on them and the herd in the pasture outside, and the legal victory folded in his hand, and it was the most uncomplicated moment Alma could remember in some time. Rutherford Clay did not return. Percival Dodd wrote later that month that the San Antonio Company had shifted its attention to other counties, presumably in search of less complicated targets. Willie Sims, when he heard this, said something brief and unprintable about land speculators that made court laugh for approximately 5 minutes. Autumn came in the way it did in the Texas Hill Country, not with the sudden drama of northern seasons, but gradually, the heat drawing back by degrees, the light changing its angle, the grass going gold and brown in slow stages. The cattle they had held through the summer were fat and ready, and they drove them to the Dusty Creek sale yards in October and got a price that exceeded even Alma's projection, which she noted with satisfaction, and which Abraham acknowledged with the particular grace of someone who had argued the other side, and was genuinely pleased to have been wrong. The autumn accounting showed them, by November, that Sunrise Ranch was not only solvent but growing. They had repaid a portion of the bank debt ahead of schedule. They had enough reserves to consider expanding the herd in the spring. The house had been repaired, and improved court had turned out to have a remarkable talent for carpentry, and had spent the slower summer days replacing porch boards and rehanging the office door, and installing a proper pantry shelf in the kitchen that made Alma's daily life considerably more efficient. They hired a third hand in October, a steady young man named Daniel Reeves, who had good references from 2 ranches in the next county, and who settled into the bunkhouse without ceremony and went to work. Life at Sunrise Ranch in the autumn of 1878 had, Alma thought, a particular quality full and purposeful and genuinely good, in the way that a life built on real work and real partnership was good. She and Abraham were, she found it difficult to put a name on what they were, exactly. What they were was that they had admitted to each other what was true, and since then the thing that was true had been allowed to simply be what it was. He sat beside her on the porch in the evenings. He brought her coffee without being asked. She mended the tear in his vest that he had been ignoring for a month and left it on the table without comment, and he picked it up without comment but looked at her with something warm in his face when she came in. When he rode out to the ridge in the evenings to watch the light, she sometimes rode with him, and they sat on their horses above the creek in the long last minutes of the day and said very little, and it was entirely sufficient. He kissed her for the first time on an October evening on that ridge, with the last gold in the western sky and the creek running dark below them, and neither of them having planned for it to be the moment, but the moment having been so clearly right that there was nothing to plan. She was looking at the sky, and then she looked at him, and he was looking at her, and she said nothing, and he said nothing, and then he leaned forward on his horse, and she leaned forward on hers, and it was brief and warm and terribly right. And Biscuit shifted her weight and broke the moment in the way horses did, and they both pulled back, and there was a brief laugh between them that was made of relief and happiness. "Biscuit," Alma said, addressing her horse directly, "your timing is atrocious." Biscuit expressed no remorse. Abraham was smiling in the gold light. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. On the 1st of December there was a dance in Dusty Creek. It was a seasonal affair, the kind of community gathering that the towns of that era organized regularly as a way of maintaining the social fabric in isolated country, an excuse for people to come in from the ranches and farms and see each other for a few hours in a lit building with music. The piano from the saloon was always pressed into service, supplemented by a local man named Hector who played fiddle, and whose enthusiasm more than compensated for his occasional technical lapses. Alma had not been to a dance in over 2 years. She stood in the bedroom on the evening of the first and looked at her one good dress, dark green wool, fitted, with a white collar, and put it on, and felt like a slightly different version of herself when she looked in the small mirror. She pinned her hair up and then let some of it down again, because up felt too formal, and she did not want to spend the evening managing pins. When she came out into the main room, Abraham was there in his good clothes, which were in the same register as his working clothes but cleaner and better pressed, and he looked at her in the doorway and did not say anything for a moment. "You look," he started. "Don't say anything that makes me self-conscious," she said. "I was going to say you look like yourself," he said. "But better." She thought about that. It was not the conventional compliment, but it was the right one, and she appreciated the rightness of it more than she would have appreciated anything more conventional. "You look like yourself too," she told him. He offered her his arm. They rode into town together in the small wagon, with Willie and Court and Daniel following on horseback, all of them in varying states of having made an effort. The town was brighter than usual, lamplight spilling from the meeting hall and music already audible from a block away. There were horses at every rail, and the sound of voices and laughter was the sound of people who had been too long on their own land and were glad of company. Inside the hall the air was warm, and the music was enthusiastic, and the floor was full. Alma accepted a glass of punch from a table near the door and looked around at the familiar and half-familiar faces of Dusty Creek, the Tillman family from the bank, the McAllister family from the neighboring ranch, the Dorado brothers who ran the feed store, various townsfolk she had come to recognize over the months without having learned all their names. A number of people came up to them in the first quarter hour, and she noted with a private satisfaction that she and Abraham were treated as a unit. People greeted them together, as the Sunrise Ranch partnership, as a pairing that had become established enough to be recognized. There was a matron named Mrs. Aldridge who was approximately 60 years old and the closest thing Dusty Creek had to a social institution, who looked at Alma and Abraham standing together, and then looked at them with a particular expression that was warm and knowing and said, "I do hope you plan to dance," in a tone that made it clear she had already drawn her own conclusions about the nature of their partnership. "I intend to," Abraham said, looking at Alma. "He dances," Mrs. Aldridge told Alma approvingly, as if this were a significant character reference. "I had not had the occasion to discover that," Alma said. "It's one of my less practical skills," Abraham said dryly. They danced. He was, in fact, perfectly good at it, not showy, but steady and sure of his own movement, which was the most important quality. She had grown up dancing at occasions like this, and she was good at it too, and it turned out that they were good together in the same way they were good together at most things, matching each other without competition, each moving in the space the other left. She looked up at him while they were dancing, and he was looking at her with that open expression, the one she had come to think of as his real face, the one that appeared when he was not managing how he appeared. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Something I want to ask you," he said. "Ask it." "Not here," he said. "Not in the middle of a dance floor." She looked at him more carefully. He was not nervous. Exactly, nervousness implied uncertainty, and what she read in his face was not uncertainty but something more like careful intention, the quality he had when he was about to say something he had thought about thoroughly and was ready for. "When we get home?" she asked. "When we get home," he agreed. They stayed at the dance another hour, dancing and talking and drinking punch and watching Court discover that he was a very good dancer, and that several of the young women of Dusty Creek had noticed this fact with interest. Willie Sims sat in a corner most of the evening having a serious conversation with a man of similar age about horses, which appeared to be exactly what Willie considered a good evening. On the ride home the night was cold and clear, the stars the kind that appeared only on winter nights, enormous and specific, and the wagon moved through the dark with the horses breathing steam in the cold air. They rode in comfortable silence most of the way, close together on the wagon seat, the cold making proximity natural. At the ranch, they settled the horses, and Court and Willie and Daniel went to the bunkhouse, and the main house was theirs in the dark and the cold of the December night, and she lit a lamp in the main room and stirred the coals in the stove back to life while Abraham hung his coat and turned from the door. "Ask your question," she said, turning from the stove. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, close but not crowding, and she looked up at him in the lamplight. "I have been," he said, slowly and carefully, the way he spoke when the words mattered to him and he wanted them to be right, trying to think of the best way to say this. "I've been trying for several weeks now. I don't think there is a best way, so I'm going to say it plainly." "Please," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build this ranch with you and live my life with you, and I'm asking if that is something you want." She looked at him for a moment. The stove ticked quietly as it heated. The lamp made a warm globe of light around them. Outside the windows, the winter stars were enormous. "I want to point out," she said, "that we have an agreement, a formal business agreement, with a buyout clause." "I know," he said. "I wrote some of those clauses myself. Are you asking me to renegotiate? I am asking you to replace the whole document with a different arrangement entirely." She was quiet. She was aware of her heart doing what it had been doing with increasing frequency around this man, which was to make itself known in a way that was entirely inconvenient and entirely right. "Abraham," she said. "Yes. You are not a man who does anything carelessly," she said. "I've watched you for 8 months. Every decision you make, you think it through, you consider it, you are certain before you commit." "That's correct," he said. "So when you say you want to marry me," she said, "you are saying that you have thought it through and considered it and you are certain." "Yes," he said. "Are you asking me if I'm sure?" "I'm telling you that I am sure," she said, "and I am making certain we are in the same place." Something in his face shifted and became, she did not have a word for it exactly. The closest word was open. He was entirely open in the way a very private and careful person was rarely entirely open, and she felt the weight and the rightness of it land. "We are in the same place," he said. "Then yes," she said. "The answer is yes." He put his hands on her face, gently, the way he touched things he valued, and he kissed her properly this time, not on a ridge on horseback with a horse interfering, but in the lamplight of the house they had built together, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating under her palms, and thought that this was the best use to which a business arrangement had ever been put. They were married in February of 1879, in Dusty Creek's small church, on a cold, bright day when the sky was a particular shade of blue that Alma would remember for the rest of her life as the exact color of that morning. Mrs. Aldridge cried at the ceremony, which she did at every ceremony, but with what appeared to be extra enthusiasm. Percival Dodd attended, riding 2 days from his home to be there, and clasped Abraham's hand afterward and looked at Alma and said, "I knew it when I wrote those letters," with the self-satisfaction of a man who had been right about something and intended to remember it. Willie Sims wore a clean shirt and stood in the back of the church with his hat in his hands and looked at the floor most of the time, which was as close as Willie got to emotional expression. Court cried, which he did openly and without embarrassment, because he was 19 years old and felt things simply and directly and found nothing wrong with that. After the church they had a gathering at the ranch, a proper meal, tables brought outside because the house could not hold everyone, the cold air made tolerable by the fires and the warmth of the crowd. The afternoon went long and golden, and Alma found herself, at some point in the middle of it, standing slightly apart from the gathering with a cup in her hands, looking at Sunrise Ranch in the February light, the timber house, the barns, the creek glinting in the distance, the winter grass waiting to come back, and feeling something that she thought was probably the most uncomplicated version of happiness she had ever experienced. Abraham found her there, as he usually did when she stepped away from a crowd. He came to stand beside her and followed her gaze out over the ranch. "Still worth getting up before sunrise for?" he asked. She leaned against his shoulder. "Yes," she said. "Still worth it." Spring came, as it always did, with a particular kind of urgency that felt like the land remembering what it was for. The grass returned, the creek ran full, the herd that they had wintered through was healthy and beginning to show the season's calves, small and uncertain on new legs, filling the pastures with the particular life of beginning. Alina Vasquez visited in April, the woman whose 40-page letter had helped them defeat Rutherford Clay's legal challenge. She was traveling through the county on her own business and had written ahead to say she would stop. She was 32 years old, dark-haired and direct, and possessed of the specific competence of someone who had been fighting for what she owned for long enough to have become very good at it. She spent 2 days at Sunrise Ranch, and she and Alma talked for most of those 2 days about land law and cattle management, and the particular challenges of holding property in a region where the legal and social systems were not consistently applied without regard to the person applying. Abraham sat in on some of those conversations and contributed thoughtfully to others, and Alma noted, watching him, that he listened to Alina Vasquez with exactly the same quality of attention he brought to anything he considered worth listening to. She thought about what Alina had said in her letter, about how Clay specifically targeted properties he believed had less institutional support. She thought about what it meant to have a partner who did not operate that way, who had never operated that way from the first morning in the saloon. After Alina left, Alma mentioned this to Abraham. "You never, not once in 8 months, treated me as less than your equal partner," she said. "I was ready for it. I had prepared myself to fight it." He looked at her with a slight frown, not of displeasure but of consideration. "You would have been right to fight it," he said. "You knew more about ranching than I did in several important areas. Fighting it would have made sense. But you never gave me cause." "No," he said. "Why would I?" He said it as if it were a genuine question, as if the alternative had simply not occurred to him, and she thought that this was either a mark of exceptional character or of exceptional luck on her part, and she was inclined to believe it was the former. "I love you," she said, because she had been saying this to him regularly since February and it had not lost any of its accuracy. "I know," he said, which was not what she expected but which was also somehow perfect. "I love you too," he added, after a beat that she suspected was slightly intentional. She pushed his shoulder. He caught her hand. Sunrise Ranch, in the spring of 1879, was running 16 hands including herself and Abraham and the 3 resident hands, with seasonal workers coming on for the drive. They had expanded the herd to 400 head through careful purchasing over the winter. The house had been added on to quartz carpentry, had extended into a proper addition at the back, giving them a second bedroom and a small sitting room with a better stove. They had talked about a bookshelf, and then built one, and then filled it gradually with whatever books came through Dusty Creek or could be ordered from the bookseller in San Antonio. Alma was reading one of those books, a collection of botanical essays about the native grasses of the region that Abraham had ordered for her birthday as a joke that turned out to be a genuine gift, because she read it cover to cover, on an afternoon in June when she put it down and sat very still for a moment, and did a private accounting of the past several weeks, and then looked up at nothing in particular with an expression of stunned happiness. She told Abraham that evening on the porch in the long light. He was very still for about 4 seconds. Then he turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was a complete and unmanaged joy. "You're certain?" he asked. "I'm a rancher," she said. "I know the signs." He laughed, and it was the realest laugh she had heard from him, full and unguarded. He reached for her hand and she gave it to him, and he held it the way he had held it across that table in the restaurant in Dusty Creek, completely. "January," she said, "if the timing holds." "A winter baby," he said. "Texas winters are mild," she said. "The baby will be fine." Their son was born in the last week of January 1880, on a night when the wind was low and the stars were out, and Willie Sims paced the length of the bunkhouse so many times that court later reported he had worn a visible path. The birth was attended by the midwife from Dusty Creek, a calm and practical woman named Mrs. Torres, who had attended a great many births in that county and approached each one with the same steady efficiency. Alma, who had decided in advance to be practical about childbirth on the grounds that generations of women had managed it before her, and she was not going to be dramatic about it, was somewhat less practical in the event. But she was brave and determined, and Mrs. Torres said afterward that she had never had a mother who asked so many intelligent questions during labor. Abraham was present throughout, which was not the common practice of the era, but he had asked to be there, and Alma had wanted him there, and Mrs. Torres had raised one eyebrow, and then nodded and accepted this as the arrangement. He held Alma's hand for 5 hours and did not let go. Later, when their son was in her arms and she was exhausted and flooded with something that was beyond any word she could put on it, Abraham looked at the child and then at her, and she saw on his face the particular expression of a man for whom the world had just quietly rearranged itself. They named him James Rhodes Granger, for Alma's father. James was a loud and healthy baby with his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's determined set of jaw, and he grew through 1880, the way calves grew in good grass, rapidly, and with visible satisfaction in the enterprise. Sunrise Ranch grew with him. They drove 450 head to market in the autumn of 1880 and came home with enough to pay off the last of the original bank debt and still have a substantial reserve. The night they made the final payment at the bank, Abraham came home with a bottle of good brandy that he had bought at the Dusty Creek Saloon, an extravagance he explicitly noted as justified, and they sat on the porch after James had been settled to sleep, and they drank brandy in good glasses, the crystal glasses that had been a wedding present from Percival Dodd, and looked out at the ranch in the dark and the stars. "The deed is entirely ours," Alma said. "It has been since the day we signed it," he said. "You know what I mean." "I do," he said. He looked at the glass in his hand and then at her. "I keep thinking about that morning at the saloon, the sunrise." "Our great business decision," she said. "The best one I ever made," he said, and he was not talking about the ranch. She looked at him. "Me too," she said. Willie Sims left them in the spring of 1881, not unhappily. He had saved enough to put a deposit on a small piece of land in the next county, a modest property that had been the subject of his ambition for years, and Abraham negotiated a good price for it for him, and Court rode out to help him move his belongings. Willie shook hands with both of them when he left and was gruff about it in the way he was gruff about everything that mattered, and Alma pressed a jar of preserved peaches into his hands and told him she expected a letter when he was settled, and he said he would see about that, which from Willie meant yes. Court stayed on. He was 22 now, and had grown from an enthusiastic boy into a solid and capable young man, who was becoming a genuinely skilled rancher in his own right, and Abraham had promoted him to lead hand over 2 of the newer workers. He was also, as of the autumn of 1881, courting a young woman named Mee Patterson from a farm 3 miles east, which occupied considerable portions of his off-work thinking, and occasionally required patient conversation with Abraham about the general subject of how to proceed when you cared about someone and were not sure how to say it clearly. Abraham gave this advice with great sincerity and then came home and reported the conversation to Alma, who pointed out that his own approach to the subject had not exactly been a textbook of efficiency. "I eventually got there," he said. "After several months of sunsets and oblique conversations," she agreed. "Did you want me to have been less careful?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "I needed every one of those sunsets." Their daughter was born in March of 1882, arriving in the world during a spring thunderstorm with the particular timing of a child who had decided the dramatic moment was the right one. They named her Clara, which had no family significance but which Alma had simply wanted, the sound of it, the light quality of it. Clara was smaller than James had been and quieter, but she looked at the world from her very first days with the same steady attention that her father brought to everything, a serious and observant watchfulness that made the older hands say she was an old soul. James, who was now 2 years old and an established force of nature within the household, received his sister with a period of skepticism, followed by a sudden and total adoration that became one of the defining features of both their childhoods. Sunrise Ranch in the early 1880s was, by the measure of that era and that region, a successful operation. They were not wealthy in any grand sense, but they were secure, which Alma had always valued over wealth, secure and growing and doing work they were good at, and that mattered. The land was their own. The cattle were their own. The decisions were their own, made jointly with the same honest directness they had applied from that first morning. There were hard years in the mid-1880s. The winter of 1884 was brutal, the kind that came rarely to Texas but came with full force when it did, and they lost cattle and had to make difficult decisions about the herd and the reserves. Court, who was a full partner in spirit by this point even if not yet in deed, worked through that winter with them without complaint and proved his worth beyond any previous measure. Daniel Reeves, the third hand, had by this time married and moved on to a property of his own, and they had cycled through a number of other workers, some of whom stayed and became part of the fabric of the place, and some of whom moved on as people in that era moved on, following the restless motion of the frontier. Abraham turned 40 in 1888. Alma was 36. James was 8, Clara was 6, and there was a third child, a boy named Henry, born in 1885, who had his mother's dark hair and his father's quiet temperament, and who had already demonstrated a talent for mathematics that delighted Alma and mildly mystified Abraham. By 1888, Sunrise Ranch had grown to 600 acres, the result of a careful purchase of the adjacent 40 acres when that land came up for sale 2 years prior. They had a reputation in the county as a well-run operation and as people who dealt fairly, which was the reputation that lasted the longest and meant the most in that time and place. On the morning of their 10th wedding anniversary, Alma woke before dawn, which she had never stopped doing, and went out to the porch and stood in the early dark with a cup of coffee she had made by habit in the sleeping house. The ranch was dark and still, the distant creek making its perpetual quiet sound, the stars beginning to fade in the east as the sky found its first gray. Abraham came out after a few minutes, pulling on his coat, finding her on the porch the way he always found her. He did not say anything. He stood beside her and she gave him her cup and he drank from it and handed it back, which was a kind of intimacy so established as to be past commentary. They stood and watched the sky light. 10 years, she said quietly. 10 years, he agreed, from a business arrangement. The most practical decision I ever made, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the sky, the way he always looked at things he was also talking about, as if looking directly at them was for the things he was not putting into words. She looked at his profile, the lines that 10 years had added to his face, the gray beginning in his hair at the temples, the same jaw that had caught the early saloon light on the morning of April the 14th, 1878. Abraham, she said. He turned and looked at her. I would do it again, she said. All of it, from the beginning. He looked at her for a moment with everything unguarded, all the careful management entirely absent, the way he had looked at her across candlelight and on a ridge above a flooded creek and in a church on a cold blue February morning. So would I, he said, every single morning of it. The sun came up over the edge of the eastern hills, the same sun that had been coming up over Dusty Creek and Sunrise Ranch for 10 years, and it lit the grass and the creek and the cattle in the pasture and the timber house and the solid barns, and the faces of 2 people who had made a business arrangement at Sunrise and had spent the better part of a decade discovering what it was actually made of. James came banging out the door at that moment, 8 years old and incapable of approaching anything quietly, and launched himself against Abraham's side with the complete confidence of a child who has never once not been caught. What are you looking at? James demanded, peering out at the pasture. The ranch, Abraham said, catching him easily, his arm going around the boy. We see it every day, James said. That's the point, Alma said. Clara appeared in the doorway behind them, smaller and quieter, her dark hair still loose from sleep. She looked out at the morning with her father's serious eyes, and then came and leaned against Alma's side, and Alma put her arm around her daughter, and the four of them stood on the porch of Sunrise Ranch in the early light and watched the day begin. Henry's voice came from inside the house, asking about breakfast, because Henry had never in his 3 years failed to have his priorities in order. Abraham looked at Alma over the children's heads, and she looked back at him, and there was something in that look that contained all 10 years and the years that were still to come, the ordinary, extraordinary substance of a life built honestly on good ground. "Come on then," Abraham said, steering James back toward the door. "Your brother's going to starve." "Henry always says that," James said. "And someday he might be right," Alma said, following them in, her hand trailing along the door frame of the house that had been a stranger's empty property and was now completely and irreversibly theirs. The sun climbed. The creek ran. The cattle moved in the morning pasture. Sunrise Ranch went about its day. There were years ahead that would bring their own weight and their own joy. The year Court married me and Abraham stood beside him at the ceremony with the same steadiness he had brought to everything. The year Henry went east to a school in Austin and came back 2 years later with a degree in accounting and a determination to apply it to the ranch's books that changed their financial management entirely. The year Clara, at 16, showed a talent for animal doctoring that eventually took her to study formally in the next decade, when that became possible for women, and brought her back to the county as the most respected veterinarian in 3 counties. The year James took over the daily management of the herd with a competence that made both his parents quietly proud and explicitly say so. There were hard years too, because ranching in Texas did not offer any guarantees, and they faced them the way they had always faced hard things, with honesty between them and a willingness to argue through problems to their solutions, and the particular comfort of knowing that whatever was coming, they were not facing it alone. On a December evening in 1895, 17 years after a very practical arrangement had been made over coffee in a half-lit saloon, Alma and Abraham sat on the porch of Sunrise Ranch in the last of the afternoon light, which was a habit so old as to be architecture. The ranch was full. James was at the main house with his young wife. Clara was visiting from her work in the county. Henry was inside doing something with ledgers that he would report on with great detail after supper. From the bunkhouse and the barns came the sounds of the working day winding toward evening. Alma's hair was threaded with gray now, and she wore it differently, more loosely, in a way that she had arrived at over years without ever making a formal decision. Abraham's temples were fully silver, and the lines of his face were the lines of a man who had lived outdoors and worked hard and laughed enough, which was the best kind of lines there were. "You know," she said, looking out at the creek catching the last light, "I never thought much about what I wanted my life to look like. I only thought about what I wanted to do." "And," he said. "It turned out to be the same thing," she said. He reached over and took her hand the same way he had reached across a restaurant table in Dusty Creek in August of 1878, palm up, an invitation. She took it. The stars were coming out in the east, one by one, the way they always did over Sunrise Ranch, steady and certain, and one after another, filling the Texas sky with their particular kind of permanent light. Inside the house, their children's voices rose and fell in conversation and laughter. The fire in the stove sent warmth through the walls. The cattle settled in the pastures. The creek ran on in the dark, and the rancher and his wife sat on the porch of the land they had made together, hands joined, and watched the night come in.